I mentioned before you came out that many people may not have heard of you or the organization you run called Tala. So I just want to share a couple of data points that might get people thinking. So the first data point I want to share is that you're based in Los Angeles. Not exactly a development hub, all right? But my argument to all of you, which we'll hear about in a minute, is that actually Los Angeles, perhaps because of Tala, is becoming one. You have raised a pretty historic amount of money. I looked into this to try to figure it out, and I think it's among the largest amounts ever raised by a woman CEO of a startup in history. It's up there, $104 million so far, is that right? Mm-hmm. And just to give you a sense of the scale of Shivani's ambition, your most recent hire that I read about is Uber's chief data officer, who left Uber to join Tala. Yep. You're really on the cusp of doing something big. Talk to us about what is Tala up to?
So I always want to start with our mission. So Tala's mission is to expand financial access, choice, and control for the underserved globally. And so for us, I mean, I start every board meeting with that. I start every recruiting meeting, and so I feel like that is the most important thing to get across. The other piece to get across, though, and this kind of relates to the context of our work, is that only about 30% of the adult population worldwide is covered by a credit bureau. And so what that means is that there are billions of people that are currently underserved by traditional financial institutions and financial services. And so I know a lot of us here all know that, but the way that we're solving that problem is that we developed an Android platform that allows us to instantly credit score someone using our behavioral data on them as well as kind of smartphone data that they allow us access to. We then use that credit score, and we also act as a lender and take the risk on these customers. We service them entirely digitally. We've integrated into kind of any payment rails of their choosing, so they can pick it up in cash, retail locations, ATMs, banks, mobile money. So it's incredibly instant, and about 85% of our customers will actually get money in their accounts in under 2 minutes after downloading the application. So I want to get
into that part of it, because hopefully you're getting that sense of an Uber type platform here with how quickly people will get access. But just to take a step back, the credit score, you're right, there's lots of people here who are aware of that issue, lots of people working on financial inclusion for a long time, but I think the prevailing mindset has been, well, financial inclusion is about setting up financial institutions, it's about loaning money or giving money and having some kind of an audit trail, but the credit score wasn't necessarily the key component. You came at this with this unique perspective that the credit score is the missing piece. Why is that so important?
Well, I think that I always think of it as there are products out there like microcredit and others, but really if we want to change the foundation of the financial system, then we need to create the core of it. We need to create that credit score that will then enable all of us, including our customers, to have that choice, that control to interact with the system in the same way that we do.
Right, and it seems to me that if you can unlock the credit score, then we can go from seeing people who are at the lowest end of the income scale as just a risk, right? As just maybe a beneficiary to a consumer, to someone you can invest in, someone you can lend in.
And I would argue that it's not even just changing the perception of risk, but I would say that it's actually how do we develop something that is much more holistic? How do we think about it as a score or a profile tells us about what someone needs to do with money, what they want to do, and what they should do? And so it's really about the daily life of the customer and then saying, how do we now build customized financial products around that daily life?
So you just started a few years ago. How many customers do you actually have? How many people go to your app and download it and actually ask for money and get a loan?
So we now have 1.5 million customers on the platform across 5 different countries.
It's pretty incredible. What are those 5 countries?
So we're pretty spread out. One of the things is obviously proving that this can work globally. So we're currently on 3 continents. So we're in Kenya, Tanzania, the Philippines, Mexico, and India.
And what do you think is the ambition of Tala? Like, will we expect to see you in the way we've seen other Silicon Valley type businesses, app-driven businesses, grow to an enormous scale? What do you think? What's your ambition as you grow this organization?
I think we think of it as how do we continue to develop a relationship with these customers? And so how can we actually serve them throughout their financial life? I kind of think of it as, we've got a series of books
Yeah.
that we will hopefully write. And, the first book that we started with is financial identity. We then added on credit. From there, there's savings, there's insurance, there's financial education that has to underpin all of these things. And so I want us to go book by book. And I think at the moment, we haven't actually finished the credit story. And we're really only in the first few chapters. And so I have big ambitions for us and a big vision, but at the same time, I want us to stay focused as a company.
Now, these are largely underserved customers, so I'm just trying to think, who are your competitors? Are you out to disrupt microfinance institutions? If someone works in microfinance, should they be worried that their industry could be disrupted? Or is it the traditional banking system? Who are you really disrupting in the development sector?
I would say that it's really not microfinance institutions or even traditional banks. I think there is a space for all of us. And I think really what we're trying to disrupt or change is probably, you can say, the loan sharks, the informal lenders that are there. But I would really say that it's disrupting the perception that people have, right? And I think in development, I think we've already all realized that we need to collaborate. And what I'm excited to see is now how can the development community and the technology community also come together and collaborate?
I think maybe one mark of your success will be when loan sharks around the world know what Tala is and speak about it with fear. So give us a sense, when you look more broadly at financial inclusion, Tala is obviously one piece. It's a company. You're out there with a product. You want to get as many customers as you can. But there's a lot of people working in financial inclusion. How do you see this shift in the industry of financial inclusion, or maybe the mindset around it?
I think, one, we're starting to realize that, we do have to think about scale from the beginning. When we think about financial inclusion, we're starting to realize that while there's a place for, in-person trainings and in-person delivery, there is also this need to now think of how can we actually be more cost efficient? How can we think about it as, if we want these programs to scale globally, then we almost have to change our mindset in that way. I think the other thing that we're realizing, at least I am within Tala, is that there's a real place, though, for community. And so for me, when I think of financial inclusion and that word around inclusion, I think it is that how can we use these really amazing things that have been there within these communities and actually then think about scalability in that way. Because I think some of the best products have scaled actually within communities without technology, without Facebook, without these things, and it's because the products have had value. And so I think maybe what I think of is financial inclusion is changing to be much more customer-driven. And in a sense, we're all taking a little bit more of a consumer mindset to how we deliver our products. That's
kind of an underlying theme here at Devex World, is the idea that we're moving from seeing people as beneficiaries to customers. And what does that actually mean for the way we all work? Let's get back to that customer for a second. So give me a sense of the average borrower from you. What's their income like, their annual income? What do they use the money for? How much do they get from you?
So on a monthly basis, our customers are making anywhere between about $300 to, I would say, max, at the most, maybe about $1,000. So still very much the underserved or the emerging middle class. And then your question was...
And then what do they use the money? They're getting loans from you. How much are the loans, and what do they use it for?
So our loans range anywhere between $10 all the way up to, I would say, about $1,000. And 70% of our customers are sole proprietors. They're using it for working capital, but they're also using it within their daily lives. And so there's a very flexible use case there.
Yeah, I think I can imagine people listening to this thinking about that customer, and traditionally we've seen them as a risk. And you talk about how you're using a credit score to not see them as so risky. Talk about that secret sauce for a second. How do you actually determine, because I think your default rate is actually pretty low on these loans, how do you figure out the credit rating for someone who doesn't have a formal job or a bank account?
Sure. So it always, when we think about credit scoring, it falls into three buckets. The first is really that we want to understand, is someone fraudulent? At the end of the day, we have a belief at Tala that if we can actually weed out fraud, then we can actually lend to about 95% of the population. And the way we think about it is that if you take fraud out, then what you're using data and data science for is actually customization. So you're thinking about how do you segment this customer, and then how do you price appropriately? And how do you actually determine, do they want a consumer product? Do they want a small business loan, an education loan? And then we actually start to kind of open those possibilities. But everyone then gets the choice of credit. So we really think of it as if we can build global fraud models, which we've now done, by finding kind of universal behavioral features on these customers across all countries, then that's the first line. From there, we think about capacity. And we think about debt-to-income ratios, what other bills or loans do they have outstanding. Then we think about character and the likelihood for someone to repay.
Some of the features I've heard you use in the credit score include things like how do people organize their contacts in their phone? Is that right? I'm not sure I would get a loan from you based on that.
I mean, again, there's no one variable that's going to move the credit score. It's all taken into context. But the reason I really like that one in particular is what we do with that variable is that we actually interact the feature. And so we think of it as, okay, you may organize your contact list in such a manner that 40% of your contacts are listed with more than, listed with first and last name. Mm-hmm. But what does that actually tell us about you? Does that tell us that maybe you actually have a phone that you don't really want to type on, right? And so we want to understand what is the device that you're actually writing on. We want to then understand what's the price point for that device, because then that tells us another indicator of your income. We want to think about it as, what's your employment? Are you a small business owner? If so, I should probably not see just John all the way through, right? I should actually see a lot of different names. So I'd expect you to maybe be more organized. But my point is actually that what we try to push our data team and all of us at Tala to do is really understand the stories behind data. It's not the data itself that's interesting, but it's really how do we make that data actually come to life.
And how many data points do you actually collect on the average consumer?
So I think that there's a statistic out there that we collect about 10,000 different data points.
Wow.
And what I would stress is that the majority of that is actually proprietary data that we collect behaviorally. So we think of it again as, if we understand kind of that you're not fraudulent, the next step for us is, how do we understand you? What questions can we ask a person? What can we understand behind how they're actually moving through our application? And we want to make it really simple and fun, but those are the things that, again, are going to be different person to person.
By the way, I know that the United Nations and innovation are not always used kind of together, but actually Shivani came out of the UN when she started this organization. You want to tell us a little bit about the backstory?
Sure. So, I mean, my background's a mix of investment banking as well as working at the UN, but when I was at the UN, that's where I found the problem. So I worked across 9 different countries and ended up actually interviewing a little over 3,500 people across these countries and really understood the daily life of these customers. In a sense, I would say, the reason I can do this work is because I viscerally believe in these customers. I believe in the fact that they are hardworking, credit-worthy, and that they have tons of potential. And so in that sense, I think it became very obvious to me that once I found the problem, I had to think of how could I find a solution. But what I started to realize is that solution was actually very much in line with understanding their daily life and all the data that can actually be generated from that life.
It's that customer focus. So one of the things we're going to do that's, I think, interesting during the day is we're going to go out to people who are in the audience because we've got so many incredible leaders and professionals across the development community here, and we want to get your take on what we're discussing. So Priya Vora is here. Priya, I've known you in many incarnations. I think you ran the development, the kind of digital and mobile part of USAID for about 8 years. You're now at Future State, based in India. I hadn't heard of Future State, to be totally honest, but I know it's a pretty important initiative out of the Rockefeller Foundation, looking at a lot of the kinds of issues we're talking about right here. So I'd love to get your thoughts and your kind of input into this discussion.
To respond, and it's so nice to hear the story of Tala. I've been 15-year veteran in the microfinance space. And what I think is so exciting this morning is hearing about how data, which I think seems kind of meaningless and small, can be aggregated and really help to transform the lives of women and underprivileged communities around the world. And it's not just about ushering in financial services. I mean, we're seeing incredible use cases around the world of using data to target and predict healthcare needs before doctors can, or to identify climate risks at a really micro level and develop early warning systems. So this idea for me of data is probably the most powerful one, and has the opportunity to transform lives. And yet, I think we're just starting to understand the repercussions of data, and what it means for companies and governments to know so much about us. You know, you see the rise of the surveillance state in China, or you see just in this country how data in the hands of corporate actors can literally threaten our democratic systems. So, you know, it's this paradox where on one hand you think about how those who are not financially rich, but who are data rich, have the opportunity to use their data to access the financial sector or the formal markets. But it's exactly those same people who are probably most vulnerable to having their data used against them. And you know, I've just come back from 4 months in India where I saw best and worst in practice. So I guess for me, the call to action here, and as you said, Raj, we're all here because we're bound by this mission in life to create a more prosperous and inclusive world. And if that's true, I think data has to now be on our agenda. You know, specifically, we should be asking ourselves as development organizations and as companies, you know, what's the data that people, or that we're collecting on people, and do they know it? And consent, of course, is not enough. Or we should be asking if we have the data wrong, you know, are there systems in place for disputing that data and rectifying that data? Or, you know, another one that I think is just really important for us is if we are collecting data and analyzing data about people and not serving their needs, can they take their data elsewhere and go to someone who can? And these questions are really fraught. They're not easy, they're tricky. So I don't want to suggest it's obvious, but I think that if we get it right, we're going to see the opportunity for data to create incredibly and unexpected new pathways out of poverty. But if we get it wrong and if we don't contribute to this issue, we might just be part of one of the more scary trends in human history, where those who are disenfranchised become even more so. So yes, at Future State, you know, our role is to build coalitions who are thinking about data governance and the structures to make sure that data is used for more positive purposes.
Thank you for adding that to the conversation, Priya. It's very helpful. And you know, I tend to think there's kind of two sides to that coin. Probably a lot of development organizations are sitting on data they're not using. Maybe data that could potentially really help the end beneficiary consumer. And on the other hand, you probably have newer organizations that are, like yours, that are very focused on data. How do you see that coming from the UN, having kind of seen both sides of this coin? Where do you see yourself in that?
I would agree with you. I mean, I think that, you know, everyone in this room does have valuable insights and valuable data on these customers. And I think one of the challenges, and this is why we've had to kind of, you know, create this solution, was that we had no data. You know, we had only in-person kind of survey data, which when we took it to banks, they would tell us that, how do we know this data is actually accurate? So we had to find more seamless ways to actually bring in the data from the person up, but to make sure that it was actually accurate. And so I would agree with Priya that we do need to, you know, create ways where customers are consenting, but also understanding the kind of data, how it's used. And so we educate our customers and we tell them it is not going anywhere other than being used for your credit score. We also tell them that we report negatively and positively to the bureaus, but customers actually, again, own that, and they decide whether they want that reported. We also educate them on the fact that they don't need to continuously give us data. And so they have the choice of actually, every time we score them, giving us access to that data again. And so in that sense, we're putting the power in their hands. But I would say that if we had had data, I think the solution would also look different.
Just even mentioning the positive and negative reports to credit bureaus, so much of what Priya's talking about, what you're talking about, really comes down to governments and what's the regulatory environment, what's the, how are they fostering these kinds of innovations. These kind of credit bureaus themselves are kind of antiquated, right? In the sense you can only report that someone did a good thing or someone did a bad thing vis-a-vis their credit score.
Well, and I mean, I would argue outside of even bureaus, in some of the markets that we work in the Philippines, for instance, there's no national ID system. And so there are 17 different IDs that are accepted. And so when you think of being a lender in a market like that, we had to figure out how we do digital KYC. If we want to keep the experience seamless for the customer, then we also need to think about how we're going to be able to score them, but actually identify them first.
Right. Yeah, you brought up so many issues that tie to a lot of the things we're going to hear about today. How do you identify people, get them connected to the internet? How do you get them banked? But then at the same time, how do you make sure that all this data that they own, even someone with very few assets or no assets, the data is their asset? And these are really core issues, I think, to the future of how all of us are going to work. So I want to thank you so much for coming out, for telling us this story. I think it was new to many people, but it is a remarkable thing that you are building. So congratulations.
Thank you.